The story begins at the home of the narrator's father-in-law, where she, driven by an uncontrollable desire while her boyfriend sleeps, decides to seek a clandestine encounter. With caution and adrenaline, she ensures her partner is deeply asleep before heading to her father-in-law's room. Entering the dim bedroom, she is captivated by the risk of the situation and the presence of the older man, which intensifies her excitement and her determination to follow through with her plan. After waking her father-in-law and confessing her intentions, both immerse themselves in a passionate encounter lasting about 20 minutes, defined by intensity and wild abandon. Despite the constant fear of being discovered, the connection between them is immediate and silent, built on a mutual understanding that requires no words. Once the act is over, she returns to her room with a mix of satisfaction and triumph, convinced that the maturity and experience of her father-in-law have awakened unique emotions within her. Upon returning to bed with her boyfriend, the protagonist experiences a duality of feelings, a slight sense of guilt mixed with great satisfaction from the adventure. She makes sure to leave no physical traces of the encounter and snuggles up to her partner, who remains oblivious to what transpired in the next room. However, far from being an isolated event, this night marks the beginning of a recurring secret affair that she decides to continue even the following morning, taking advantage of her boyfriend leaving for work. The narrator justifies her actions through a life philosophy based on seeking personal happiness and seizing every opportunity for pleasure, regardless of social norms or external expectations. She argues that life is short and that her forbidden relationship makes her feel more alive than ever. Although she acknowledges that she is betraying her partner's trust and that her actions could be harshly judged by others, she maintains that she is causing no harm as long as the secret is kept. Finally, the protagonist admits to leading a complex and risky double life, maintaining her stable relationship with her boyfriend while cultivating her secret romance with his father. While the adrenaline of the forbidden fuels her passion, she confesses that the awareness of her betrayal sometimes weighs on her conscience. Despite knowing that this situation cannot last forever and that she will eventually face the consequences, she chooses to ignore the future to continue fully enjoying the present and her desires. As weeks passed, the house that was once a sanctuary of family tranquility transformed into a labyrinth of electric signals and hidden meanings. The protagonist began to notice her senses had sharpened. Every creak of the wood, every shift in the light beneath a door, became a shared code with her father-in-law. What began as a nocturnal impulse branched into a meticulously orchestrated daytime routine. She learned to read her boyfriend's schedule not just with love, but with the precision of a strategist. When he closed the front door to leave for work, the very air in the house changed density. She was no longer the attentive daughter-in-law, but a woman wrapped in a game of shadows where her father-in-law's maturity acted as an irresistible magnet, offering a security and intensity that her official relationship, younger and more predictable, could not match. The relationship with her father-in-law evolved from the purely physical to an intellectual and emotional complicity that was perhaps more dangerous than the act itself. During family meals, beneath the table, their feet would brush against each other while she maintained a trivial conversation with her boyfriend about the future and wedding plans. That contrast, the warmth of her partner's hand above the table and the bold pressure of her father-in-law's foot beneath it, produced a cognitive dissonance that, far from repelling her, fed her. She began to enjoy the performance. She became an expert in the micromanagement of her emotions, maintaining the facade of a perfect girlfriend while her mind replayed the details of their last encounter in the kitchen or the garage. The older man's maturity provided a perspective on life without judgment, a freedom she felt the rest of the world tried to restrict with moral rules that now seemed distant and alien. However, danger began to graze the edges of her secret bubble. One day, while sharing an intimate moment with her father-in-law in the study, they heard the engine of her boyfriend's car earlier than expected. Panic, a cold blast that raced down her spine, was a brutal reminder of the fragility of her structure. She managed to slip out through the back door and enter through the kitchen, pretending to brew coffee, but the trembling in her hands was difficult to hide. Her boyfriend, though oblivious to the truth, noticed her agitation and attributed it to work stress. That night, as he held her in bed, she felt for the first time that the weight of the secret was not just a burden, but an insurmountable barrier distancing her from the reality she was supposed to value. The duality was becoming unsustainable. The desire to live it to the fullest was clashing head-on with the fear of the total destruction of her social world. Despite the scare, the addiction to adrenaline proved stronger than prudence. The protagonist and her father-in-law began seeking places outside the house, intensifying the risk. Trysts at motels on the outskirts, instantly deleted messages, and glances heavy with secrets at public events became her new normal. She began to question her own identity. Was she the woman who loved her boyfriend, or the one who lost herself in the arms of his father? The justification that no one was getting hurt began to falter when she saw the sadness in her boyfriend's eyes as he felt her drifting away, even when she was physically present. The affair was no longer just an exploration of personal freedom, it was a battlefield where her integrity fragmented more each day, leaving her in a limbo where happiness was as intense as it was fleeting. Finally, the tension reached a point of no return. During an anniversary dinner, her father-in-law made a subtle comment, a private reference to a shared moment that only the two of them knew. The silence that followed was eternal. Her boyfriend frowned, confused by the familiarity of the tone, but said nothing. In that instant, the protagonist realized the game was ceasing to be a game. Her father-in-law's gaze, once full of triumph, now showed a spark of possessiveness that frightened her. She realized that by breaking the rules of society, she had also broken the rules of her own emotional safety. Now, caught between two men who represented opposite versions of her life, she stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next step, whether toward the truth or toward a deeper lie, would change her destiny forever, with no way back. Gemini.
Ha!
Deka. That anniversary night, following the father-in-law's reckless comment, the atmosphere in the house became stifling. The protagonist took refuge in the bathroom, leaning her hands on the sink while trying to control the trembling of her body. The mirror reflected a stranger back at her, a woman who could no longer distinguish between loyalty and betrayal. She heard her boyfriend's footsteps approaching the door. He didn't demand an explanation, he didn't scream, but his voice was heavy with a latent suspicion, a doubt he hadn't dared to voice until then. "Why does my father talk as if he knows you better than I do?" he asked through the wood. She replied with an automatic lie, one of those that now slipped effortlessly from her lips, but she knew the veil had grown too thin. During the following days, the father-in-law's possessiveness intensified. He was no longer satisfied with fleeting encounters, he now demanded constant attention, sending messages that bordered on emotional extortion. He felt he owned her secret and, by extension, he owned her. The maturity she had so admired revealed itself as cold manipulation. He played with her fear of being discovered to keep her under his control. Every time she tried to distance herself or dedicate genuine time to her partner, her father-in-law found a way to remind her, with a word or a public gesture, that her fate was in his hands. The sanctuary of pleasure had turned into a minefield. The protagonist's mental health began to crumble. Her insomnia became chronic. In the darkness of the bedroom, while her boyfriend slept soundly, she would stare at the door, fearing that at any moment the handle would turn and her father-in-law would appear, claiming a right she herself had granted him in a moment of recklessness. The duality was devouring her. On one hand, she felt a growing contempt for herself for the systematic betrayal of a man who offered her nothing but honest love. On the other, the addiction to danger and the strange fascination with the power her father-in-law exerted over her kept her shackled. The breaking point occurred on a rainy afternoon when her boyfriend forgot some documents and returned home without warning. The protagonist was in the library with her father-in-law. They weren't doing anything explicitly wrong, but the proximity, the way he whispered in her ear and how she held a glass of wine with a familiarity that did not befit a daughter-in-law, was enough. Her boyfriend stood in the doorway, observing the scene. In that moment, there was no need for verbal confessions. Betrayal is not always a physical act caught red-handed, sometimes it is an energy, a look that excludes the person who should be included. He didn't explode in rage. Instead, his silence was devastating. He turned around and walked out of the house, letting the echo of the slamming door mark the end of an era. The protagonist tried to run after him, but her father-in-law grabbed her arm with a force that was no longer passionate, but authoritarian. "Let him go," he told her with a somber smile, "now we can finally be ourselves." It was in that instant that she understood the total horror of her situation. She had destroyed her future for an illusion of freedom, only to end up in the hands of someone who saw people as trophies of his own vanity. Weeks later, the protagonist found herself alone. Her boyfriend had cut off all communication and moved to another city, unable to process the double betrayal from the two people he trusted most. The father-in-law, seeing that the power game no longer had a spectator to hurt, lost interest in her just as quickly as he had seduced her. She remained in limbo, inhabiting a house full of ghosts and memories of touches that now made her nauseous. The story ends with her sitting in the same kitchen where it all began. There was no more adrenaline, no fire, no racing hormones. Only the cold of the consequences remained. She realized that the happiness she sought, by bypassing the rules and betraying trust, was actually a mirage that had left her empty. The price of living, to the fullest, without considering the harm to others, had been her own identity. Now, facing an uncertain future, she understood that true freedom is not doing what one desires in the moment, but having the necessary integrity to avoid becoming a slave to one's own impulses. The secret affair ended not with an explosion, but with the bitter silence of absolute loneliness.